I want to make a few comments at the beginning here about what the second Decalogue, second half of the Decalogue, the second table, the last 5 commandments, how that's put together, what the overall theme. I do think that the 2 sets of commandments, the first 5 and the second 5, correspond to the 2 great commandments of Jesus. The first 5 words focus on loving God with your whole heart, soul, strength, and mind. And even though the 5th one is about honoring parents, I tried to show that there's this theological setting that shows that's also has to do with our relationship with God, because God has given us the authoritative parents that we're to honor, and our attitude to them is to be like our honor and glorification of God, and also the way that family dynamics work, as I was saying at the end of last hour. The family dynamics are supposed to work in a way that the family becomes a kind of image of the triune life. Parent-child relations should resemble the relationship between the eternal Father and his eternal Son. So the first great commandment covers the first 5 words. The second great commandment, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, covers the second 5 words. And in both cases, we can take the first commandment in each set of 5 as setting a framework or a rationale for all 5 of the commandments in that group. So, thou shalt have no other gods before me. In one sense, that commandment infuses all 10 words, as I pointed out earlier. In another sense, you could take that as the heading of the first table, and all of the first table are about having no other gods before God. That is the background to the commandment against images. It's the background to the commandment to bear the name of God weightily. It's the background to the Sabbath command. It's the background to the commandment to honor parents. And I think something similar is going on in the second 5 commandments. The 6th commandment, which is the first of the second table, sets the terms for all of the different commandments. Thou shalt not kill, sometimes translated as thou shalt do no murder. That's a kind of heading for the second half of the Decalogue. And in order to see how that's the case, we have to look back to Genesis 9, where we get the rationale, a theological rationale for the prohibition of killing and for the institution of capital punishment after the flood. That's not given in the 10 words, as I pointed out on Tuesday at the beginning of the week, that the second half of the Decalogue, the second table, most of those commandments are very short, 2 words. Not kill is basically what that's a literal way to translate what's said in the 6th commandment. But Genesis 9 does give us a rationale. Why is it wrong to kill? And it's given a theological rationale. This is Genesis 9, beginning of verse 4. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, with its blood. Noah is given permission to eat meat, but he's not given permission to eat blood, and so the blood has to be drained out. Surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. And from every man's brother I will require the life of him. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made him. As for you, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Why is Noah now given permission to apply an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for life principle to somebody who commits murder? It's because man is made in the image of God. But what's the connection there? What's the connection between punishing people who shed human blood with death and the image of God? I think the rationale is that because man is made in the image of God, anyone who assaults a human being is assaulting the image of God. And because of that, an assault on a human being, especially a deadly assault on a human being, is treated with the utmost severity and has to be punished. It's not just that it's not merely a kind of an assault. The rationale is not merely a way of keeping peace. We need to have a deterrence. So we institute capital punishment to deter people from committing crimes, to committing murder. The rationale is a theological one. The reason why this is a just punishment is because they attacked the image of God in the one that they killed. So I believe that rationale fits everything else that comes in the second half of the Decalogue. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, because killing is an assault on the image of God. Thou shalt not commit adultery is also the rationale for that is also that adultery is an assault on the image of God, because marriage, as we'll see tomorrow, perhaps later today, marriage is a living image of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel, between Christ and the church. So if adultery is an attack on marriage and undermines marriage, then it's an attack on that image, that icon, that living icon of God and his people. Theft. As we'll see, theft is treated differently than murder in the law, but theft is also a kind of an assault on a person. It's assault on the image of God. God is the Lord of all. Everything in the world belongs to him. He is an owner. He has property. Everything is his property. As his image, we have property. And that property is, in some ways, part of our being. It's part of who we are. I don't know if any of you have suffered been stolen from. Your house has been broken into. Your car has been broken into. Your car has been stolen. You've been robbed on the street. If you've had that kind of experience, then you know that it feels like an attack on you. You can say, well, all they did was take my car. It didn't really hurt me because all they did was take my car. But in reality, it does hurt you. You feel it as a personal attack. For me, the most dramatic experience of this was way back when I was a young teenager. And I have two brothers. The three of us were out in the garage working on my second brother's, the middle brother's car. And we started coming into the house from the garage, and my mother shouted from the other room, "Run to the neighbors, we're being robbed." And just at that moment, a man came around the corner and started coming into the kitchen. We were entering the kitchen from the garage. He's entering the kitchen from the other side. He's got a stocking over his face, a black stocking over his face, and he's carrying a butcher knife. And they had broken into the house from the back. My father was a medical doctor, and he had drugs in the house that they knew he was a medical doctor, so they asked for certain kinds of drugs. Nobody was hurt. Nothing was actually taken. It ended up that they ended up running away before they were able to take anything. But that lingered with me. It's still one of the most vivid memories of my youth. I can still see that guy coming around the corner. And they didn't actually steal anything. So nothing was taken. And yet the fact that they came into the house felt like as an attack on us. Like they came right into the room where my parents were. One of them had a gun. My father was on the phone. My mother was sitting in the den, and they came right in with weapons. And my parents obviously felt that this is their home, this is their space, and now these criminals have invaded their space. And other occasions when I suffered some kind of loss of property, I can calm myself and adjust to it by saying it's just stuff. It hadn't hurt me, but you feel it as some. The whole point of this is to say assaults on property are also assaults on persons. In some cases, that's a really obvious point. If you assault somebody's property and steal their whatever they need to make a living, you steal a farmer's tractor that he uses to to plant and to harvest is, that is an assault on the person, not just on the property. So that too is a kind of murder. It's an assault on the image of God. The ninth word, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That's an assault on the person's name and reputation, and you lie about him. You swear that something is true and it's not true. You swear in court that something is true and it's not true. You're damaging his reputation and his name, and that again is not just an external assault on his reputation, it's an assault on the person, because the person and his reputation are bound up together. So that too is a kind of murder. Covetousness is internal. Coveting is desire. To covet is to desire. And what God is forbidding is evil desires for the wrong things. If we desire those wrong things, we're on the path toward certain kinds of assaults on the image of God. If we desire our neighbor's wife, then if I desire my neighbor's wife, then I'm on the path toward assaulting his marriage and assaulting the image of God. If I desire my neighbor's property, I'm on the path toward theft, which is an assault on the image of God. Evil desire is desire to assault the image of God in these various ways. So that's not the only way to think about the second table, the second half of the Decalogue, but I think that's a helpful way to think about it. That all of these are about attacks on persons. The first 5 commandments are about honoring God as God. The second 5 are about honoring the image of God as a way of honoring God, loving your neighbor as yourself as a way of honoring the image of God. So the first question I want to ask of the 6th word is, what does it actually prohibit? Thou shalt not kill. The translation in the King James Version is pretty broad. I've swiped at some mosquitoes in my room. I don't know if I've hit some. Noel actually killed a couple of mosquitoes in the room. Did she violate the 6th word? She killed. Mosquitoes were alive. Now they're not alive anymore. Okay. I've had goat at some point this week. One time that poor goat was alive. Then somebody killed him. Is that a violation of the 6th word? So if you translate the verb there, it's ratzak. Ratzak. I'll put a transliteration if I can find it in my notes. Ratzak, translated as kill, is awfully broad, and it encompasses things that I don't think are forbidden by the 6th word. Thou shalt do no murder. That's a more recent translation of the 6th word. That's too specific, because murder is a certain kind of killing of another human being. There are times when human beings are killed that are not considered murder in the Pentateuch. Just to give a hint of the variety of uses of this word, you want to turn to Numbers 35. Numbers 35 is the whole chapter is about the institution of the city of refuge and the avenger of blood. This is the system that was used in ancient Israel to deal with murder and manslaughter. And it goes different cases. So if you have deliberate murder, somebody lies in wait for somebody else, somebody premeditates, plans to kill somebody else, that's murder. And that person has to be killed in order to cleanse the land. The land has received the blood of his victim. The only thing that can purify the land is the blood of I'll make a qualification of this in a little bit, but basically the main thing that purifies the land is the blood of the person who committed the murder. There are other cases. Remember the flying axe head. This is the flying axe head chapter. There are other cases where there's no intention to kill, there's no planning to kill. You don't lie in wait, and yet you shed human blood on the land. And in that case, the one who is a manslayer, who's committed what modern law calls manslaughter rather than murder, the manslayer goes to one of these designated cities of refuge. There are 6 of them around the land. And he has to live inside the city of refuge until the death of the current high priest. And when the high priest dies, then that's in some way removes the guilt of his killing. He didn't commit murder, and yet he has to be confined in a city of refuge for it could be for decades, possibly. If he doesn't stay in the city of refuge and comes out, then a near kinsman of the one who was murdered, of the one who was killed, is commissioned by God to be the executioner. Okay? In ancient Israel, you didn't have murder trials. You had kind of murder trials at the gates of the city of refuge, but you didn't have a judge make a decision and hand the murderer over to an executioner to have his head chopped off or to have a lethal injection or go to the electric chair. A decision was made at the gates of the city of refuge is the man is a murderer. He can't go into the city of refuge, so he's outside, and that means the near relative, who is the avenger, has to chase him down and kill him in order to cleanse the land. That's his responsibility. It's not a blood feud. It looks like a blood feud, but it's not a blood feud because it's the Lord has designated the avenger of blood to carry out this execution. And the family of the murderer can't say, well, this avenger of blood killed our brother, so we got to kill him. That would be a blood feud. You just have constant killing back and forth. This is limited to the murderer himself. Now, with that set up, the verb ratzak is used repeatedly in this chapter, but it's used in at least 3 different ways. Sometimes it's used to describe the action of a murderer. Verse 16, for example. 16 through 19, it's used repeatedly in those verses. If he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. The word murderer is a noun form of the verb ratzak. If he struck him down with a stone in his hand by which he may die and as a result died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. That's ratzak. If he struck him down with a wooden object in his hand by which he may die and as a result he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. And he pushed him out of hatred or threw something at him lying in wait, and as a result he died. Or he struck him down with his hand in enmity, and as a result died. The one who struck him down surely shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. All those uses of the word murderer are this verb. So this would be, that portion of Numbers 35 would support the translation, thou shalt do no murder, as the translation of the 6th word. But then we have other uses. For example, in verse 27, beginning in verse 26, if the manslayer shall at any time go beyond the border of his city of refuge to which he may flee, and the blood avenger finds him outside the border of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood, because he should have remained in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Okay. So the blood avenger is not guilty of any crime when he kills the manslayer. In this case, it's a manslayer. It's somebody who's committed manslaughter who's living in the city of refuge and he comes out. But in verse 27, the verb kill is again ratzak. Ratzak there is not referring to murder. It's not even referring to manslaughter. This is referring to what the blood avenger does in executing the penalty, capital punishment. Okay. And still the same verb is used. So ratzak by itself doesn't give us enough specificity. It's more narrow than killing, because the Bible doesn't forbid killing of non-humans. It's to say that it's murder is is too narrow because it can also cover cases of manslaughter. So I think probably this is a convoluted way to say it, but a translation that captures the sense and the something like the proper breadth of Ratzak is that thou shalt not be a manslayer, or thou shalt not slay a man. Because the Ratzak does cover cases of manslaughter and murder, although the person who does that is treated differently. So killing, as I said, is too broad because a variety of reasons, a variety of kinds of killing that are permitted by Torah, and I think are continued to be permitted in the New Testament. Animals, as I said, the first time we see animals, God giving permission explicitly to kill animals for food is in Genesis 9, after the flood, when Noah is given permission to and authority to carry out capital punishments. He's also given authority to kill animals and consume them. It's possible that prior to the flood, people were already killing and eating animals, but we don't. That's not never explicit. Presumably, Abel was killing an animal when he was bringing his sacrifice. So there's an implied killing of an animal, but it's not clear that that was done for a meal. I think it's probably likely that people were eating animals prior to the flood, but now there's an explicit permission given to Noah. There's nothing in the Bible that prohibits killing of animals or eating of animals. Contrary to the way some ethicists, and including some kind of Christian ethicists, have argued of late. There are ethicists that have been advocating for animal rights to the extent that they say that we should refrain from completely from slaughtering animals for food, and we should rely completely on vegetarian products. Okay, the Bible doesn't require that. Another killing that's permitted is the kind of killing that's done by a civil ruler when he's executing a punishment. There's several qualifications here. The civil ruler has to be somebody who is authorized to carry out the punishment. Numbers 35, it's the blood avenger who carries out the execution. He's commissioned by Yahweh to carry out that execution. He bears Yahweh's authority. Yahweh is the Lord of life and death, but in certain circumstances, he delegates the authority to kill to human beings. And the blood avenger. There are many cases in the Torah that indicate this, but I'll just point to one other. I read this passage earlier in the week when I was talking about abortion. Exodus 21, 22, and 23. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so she has a miscarriage, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is injury, then you shall point as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, foot for foot, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So a couple of different possible scenarios. Let's take the one that would probably be most obvious. The pregnant woman gets bumped. She goes into early labor. She dies in labor. The man who bumped into her during a fight is responsible. It's not murder in the way that Numbers 35 describes it, but it's punished like a murder. It's punished like a murder, I think, because the fight that led to the killing was already the men who were fighting were not being careful with the lives around them. I guess you could put it that way. And they were required to be. It's a negligent kind of homicide, but it's punished. If there's a death, then the person who caused the death is killed, and somebody applies that punishment. There is going to be some kind of trial. You wouldn't have an instantaneous, you killed my wife, I'm going to kill you. It has to go to some kind of court, and there's authorities that make these decisions. But then there is this delegated authority that's given in order to that carries out the death penalty, a legitimate kind of killing. Another legitimate kind of killing that occurs in the Bible is war. We talked about just war a little bit earlier in the week. The main passage about war in the Pentateuch is in Deuteronomy 20, the rules of warfare. And I'll read a bit of this. This is one of the passages that has fed into the just war tradition that I described briefly earlier in the week, where there's the basic two requirements of the just war tradition is that there has to be a just cause. You can't go to war unless you have a just reason to go to war. And then once you're in a war, you have to engage the war in a just manner. There's certain things you're not allowed to do in war. It's not just you're not given permission to do whatever you like in order to win the war. Okay. And the Deuteronomy 20 is one of the sources of those restrictions. When you go to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For Yahweh your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt is with you. It shall come about that when you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, or panic or tremble before them. For Yahweh your God is the one who goes with you. So fight for you against your enemies, to save you. The officers also shall speak to the people, saying, Who is the man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house, lest he die in battle and another man dedicated. I'll pause there. I'll come back to that in a second. But here there's a restriction on who is required to go to war. You can't take every able-bodied man, according to the rules of Deuteronomy 20. You can't take every able-bodied man and send him into war. One thing one excuse for not going to war is that he has just built a house and he hasn't yet dedicated the house. He hasn't yet lived in the house. Presumably this is a younger man. He's of the right age to go to war, but he's not going to go to war because the non-war life of peace takes priority, and he has to be given an opportunity to live his life in peace. Or who is the man that has planted a vineyard and not begun to use its fruit? Let him depart and return to his house, lest he die in battle and another man begin to use his fruit. So if you're just starting a vineyard, and the vineyard is going to take a few years to produce good fruit, you have to be given that time, and you're not allowed to be sent to war in that time period. And you might apply this in modern times by saying if somebody has just started a business and they haven't yet had a chance to get the business up and running, then they can't be conscripted to go to war. Who is the man that engaged to a woman has not married her? Let him depart and return to his house, lest he die in battle and another man marry her. Okay. So if you haven't yet married, and I would think the rule would apply also to the recently married. The recently married would not go out to war. I mean, one of the things that's going on here is, of course, a practical concern. If you got a guy who has just built a house, he hasn't lived in it, just planted a vineyard, let's say he just got married, all three of those. He's done all of those three in the last year, and then there's a war, and he's sent out to war reluctantly. He's not going to be the best warrior. He's going to be thinking, my wife is back there. My house, I didn't get to finish my house. I never ate a single one of the grapes from my vineyard. So there's a kind of practical reason why these categories of people would not be allowed. But I think the rationale behind it really is that the law is, Deuteronomy is prioritizing the life of production and peace, living in the land in peace. And that has to take priority over war. And then there's another category that's sent home. Let the officers speak further to the people, and let them say, Who is the man who is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's heart melt like his heart. Okay. So anybody who's too scared to go to war doesn't have to go to war. Again, that's the reason for that is given in verse 8. If he's afraid, that fear is going to be contagious, and when he gets in the midst of a battle, the people around him are going to be afraid too, and he's going to demoralize the army. It shall come about when the officers have finished speaking to the people, they shall appoint commanders of armies and head of the people. And then the procedures for conducting the war. So that's all before the war begins. When you approach a city to fight against it, this is normal war for Israel. This is not carnal warfare. This is not holy war. They didn't do this for Jericho. They didn't offer peace to Jericho. But if they're going to war in other circumstances other than the conquest, this is what they do. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And it shall come about, if it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, it shall be that all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. Okay? So there's an offer of peace, a possibility for reconciliation. They become servants. Think of the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua. The city of Gibeon hears about Jericho. They hear about Ai. They're afraid of Joshua. They're afraid of Israel. And so they disguise themselves and they go to Joshua and they say, please let us become part of your, we come from a far country. Please let us be part of Israel. And Joshua allows them to come into Israel and then discovers that they were deceiving him. But he still keeps his promise and they become part of Israel. But they're given menial duties. They become servants of Israel. But they're incorporated into Israel. That's a good thing. So here in this case, you've got a city that doesn't belong to Israel. If they sue for peace, they become a part of Israel. They're servants, but they're in the people of God. And over time, they become more fully incorporated into Israel. Then verse 13, when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. The women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourselves. You shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given to you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not the cities of those nations nearby. So that's the distinction between the cities nearby are the ones that are going to be conquered with holy war. The more distant cities, this is the procedure. Let's skip down to verse 19. This is another interesting restriction on war. When you besiege a city a long time, to make war against it in order to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against it. For you may eat from them, and you shall not cut them down. For is the tree of the field of man, that it should be besieged by you? Only the trees which you know are not fruit trees you shall destroy and cut down, that you may construct siege works against the city that is making war with you until it fails. Okay. So you can't make total war against, there's restrictions on the war, on who goes to war. There's restrictions and procedures for declaring war and prosecuting the war. And there's certain kinds of even inanimate objects that you can't attack. Productive trees in the land you can't use as trees and lumber for your siege works. And if you can't use productive trees that are providing you with food, then what about the people of the land who are not attacking you, who just get caught in the middle before the war, caught in the middle of the war? If you're not supposed to cut down fruitful trees, then you're reasoning, as Paul does about oxen, how much more should you not attack fruitful people? So if Israel goes into a part of the land where they're invading a neighboring land and they're carrying on war, and there are people are just farming their land, they haven't become part of the army. I think they're outside of, they're protected. Israel's not supposed to just attack them. Okay. So war is permitted under these restrictions, again, in the Christian tradition, based on this passage and some others, and then just general reasoning about war. There's been further restrictions that have been added in the just war tradition. But the Christian church has generally recognized that civil authorities in the New Covenant also have power and authority to both execute in capital punishment and to carry on war. I think the classic passage, of course, is in Romans 13. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who themselves are opposed will receive condemnation in themselves. Rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you'll have praise of the same. For it is a minister, the word is diakonos, he's a deacon. The civil ruler is a deacon of God for your good, a servant of God for your good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon those who practice evil. So obviously not all civil authorities act this way, but even civil authorities who don't acknowledge God are still established by God and given their authority providentially by God. And they have the authority of the sword, which is the sword of war and the sword of capital punishment. And that's a legitimate use of authority, a legitimate use of force in the New Covenant as in the Old. Now, having said all that, there are certain kinds of killing of human beings that don't violate the sixth word. But having said all that, there are restrictions and constraints on every kind of killing that is commonplace in the Old Testament. No killing is ever simply allowed, even with no restrictions and no constraints. Even killing of animals. When Israel is in the wilderness living near the tabernacle, then every time they butcher an animal, they have to bring the animal to the altar, and it has to be slain as a peace offering, and then they get the meat from the peace offering. Once they get into the land and they're no longer capable practically of going to the tabernacle every time they want to butcher something, they're allowed to butcher in their own homes, but they have to do it according to a particular procedure that's laid out in Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12:20, when Yahweh your God extends your border as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you desire to eat meat, then you may eat meat whatever you desire. If the place which the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, then you may slaughter of your herd and flock which Yahweh has given you as I have commanded you. You may eat within your gates whatever you desire. Just as a gazelle or a deer is eaten, so you may eat it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat it, the unclean and clean person. Only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it out on the ground of water, like water. So even when you're killing an animal, there's an acknowledgement that the Lord is the Lord of life and death. By pouring out the blood, you're pouring out the life as a sign that the life doesn't belong to you. You're consuming the flesh without the life in it. And that's an acknowledgement that even though you're permitted to kill the animal, killing the animal is still something that is under God's authority. You do it only by God's permission, and you do it with this ritual acknowledgement that God is the giver of life. Yeah. Even when there are cases where there's been a murder or a manslaughter in the land and the culprit cannot be found, under the Old Testament law, Israel was not allowed to just move on. Blood's been shed on the land, but too bad we can't find out who did it. We file that case away. It's a cold case. We're never going to be able to find out. Even in those cases, there has to be a ritual to cleanse the land. No human blood can be shed on the land without human blood cleansing the land, or some kind of blood, rather, cleansing the land. If you know who shed the blood, and it's a murder, the blood of the murderer cleanses the land. If it's a manslaughter, he goes to the city of refuge, and the death of the high priest cleanses the land. And if you don't know who did the killing, you do this, Deuteronomy 21. If a slain person is found lying in the open country in the land which Yahweh your God gives you to possess, and it is not known who has struck him, then your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance to the cities which are around the slain one. And it shall be that the city which is nearest to the slain man, that is the elders of that city, shall take a heifer of the herd which has not been worked, which has not pulled a yoke, And the elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to a valley with running water, which has not been plowed or sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. Then the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near, where Yahweh your God has chosen them to serve him and to bless in the name of Yahweh. And every dispute and every assault shall be settled by them. All the elders of that city which is nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck has been broken in the valley. And they shall answer and say, our hands have not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it. Forgive thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, O Lord, and do not place the guilt of innocent blood in the midst of the people Israel. And the blood guiltiness shall be forgiven them. So you shall remove the guilt of innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in the eyes of Yahweh. Okay. There you can't, there's no human being that's shed blood that you can identify. There still has to be a death. Life for life is still the principle. In this case, it's an animal that substitutes for the life, and it cleanses the land. But no killing is just ignored and just becomes a matter of course. Even when Israel goes to war, okay, they have to go to war. At times they have to defend themselves. They're commissioned to go to war to conquer the land. But before they go to war, they have to do this. This is from Exodus 30, verse 11. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each of them, or the word really means muster. You're taking a census in order to gather the men of fighting age to go to battle. Take a census of the men of Israel to muster them, then each of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord. When you number, there shall be no plague among the people when you number them. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give, mustered shall give. You know the word muster? M-U-S-T-E-R, it's what you do you muster an army. Not M-U-S-T-A-R-D, that's a condiment that you put on hot dogs. That's not what I'm talking about. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give. Half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel is a contribution to the Lord. Everyone who is numbered from 20 years old and over shall give to the contribution of the Lord. The rich shall not pay more, the poor shall not pay less than half shekel when you give the contribution, the Lord, to make atonement for yourselves. And you shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel, shall give it to the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the sons of Israel before the Lord, to make atonement for yourselves. Okay. That doesn't specifically mention the fact that there's a war, but that's what the numbering is for. When census are taken, they're taken of men 20 years old and upward, which are men of fighting age. And the census is taken and the muster is done so that the men are gathered to go to war. In preparation for going to war, though, they have to pay this half shekel, which is described as atonement money. Somehow this payment covers what they're doing on the battlefield. And they can't go out onto the battlefield without paying this atonement money. Even though their killing is just, it still has to be covered by atonement money. I think the overall thrust of what the Torah says about killing is that human beings are permitted to kill, permitted to take life only if authorized by God. Permitted to take the life of the animal only if authorized by God, and you have to do it in the way that God prescribes. You have to pour out the blood. Authorized to take a human life only in the circumstances that God permits you to take a human life. Modern people tend to shudder at the idea that people kill in the name of God. But I think, in fact, that's the only legitimate time to kill, only if God permits it. If God hasn't permitted it, then you have no authority to take a life. If the Lord of life and death hasn't authorized you to take a life, then you're not authorized to take a life. And that means, for example, one practical modern illustration or application of this would be the situations where your nation goes to war and you, your church perhaps, judge it to be an unjust war. That is, there is no right cause. The Rwandan genocide. I don't remember. I can never keep straight who's attacking who. Is the Tutsis attacking the Hutu? Yeah. Hutu attacking the Tutsis? Okay. The Hutu attacking the Tutsis. So, you've got a Hutu leader who says, we're going to wipe out the Tutsis. We're going to make sure that they don't exist anymore. They're going to be Amalekites. Their name is not going to exist under heaven anymore. That's an evil military action. And even though it's authorized by somebody who has civil authority, it's not authorized by God. And a Christian should refuse. A Christian should refuse to go to war, to engage in an unjust war, and to kill, unless he is sure that the killing is just and right. And God actually has authorized him to do it. Typically, that's not the way modern Christians have operated. Many of the wars in the modern world, at least in the European context and the American context, have been wars of Christian against Christian, which I think is a pretty horrific scenario. One part of Christian United States goes to war with another part of Christian United States. Christian France goes to war against Christian England. So those are cases where I think that there's frequently there's not a just cause for the war, and yet Christians have gone along and submitted to military rulers and civil rulers who have sent them to war when they should have refused. Again, the principle is that we can kill only as God permits. If you're not in a position of authority to execute people, you don't have the authority to kill. If you're not engaged in a just military action, then you don't have authorization to engage in that military action. You had a question? Well, I think that I think you're exactly right that a lot of recent war has not been. The justification is always, in the U.S. the justification is that guy's Hitler. Every decade we have a different Hitler that we have to go and fight against. And Putin is the current Hitler, so we have to supply Ukraine with supplies. There you have a case where Ukraine's invaded, so there's a just cause on the Ukrainian side. I think a lot of the wars are exactly right. It's about resources. It's about power and so on. So I think that in certain countries, in the U.S., there are provisions for conscientious objection. And that is that you can say that I'm conscience bound, I cannot go to war. In some cases, you're still in the military, but you're not on the battlefield. That happened to people in the Second World War who were pacifists. There's a recent film, Hacksaw Ridge, is that the right one? Andrew Garfield is playing a character who is he a pacifist? Am I remembering, or is he just object to this? He's a Mennonite? Yeah. So he's a pacifist, and so he's not going to kill anybody. He doesn't think it's right for him to kill. And so he spends the whole war rescuing people. He's a medic and bringing people off of the battlefield and saving them. So that's one provision that's made allowable by the United States. I don't know what the provisions for that kind of conscientious objection are. But the issue is that in that case, I think that's based on a true story, isn't it? Am I right? Or is that just, yeah. So in that case, you have a Mennonite church from their very beginning has been pacifist. So his convictions about not killing ever are not his own personal convictions. They're the convictions of a religious group. And so you have, again, in U.S. law, you have protections of religious liberty that are part of it. So I think in the best circumstances, you would have a legal system where those kind of options are available. I think also in the best scenario, you'd have a church or churches that would make judgments about the legitimacy of their members going to war. I mean, the presumption of modern people is that if the nation state goes to war, you as a citizen are obligated to go to war. That was not the case in like the Western Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages. The church had the authority to determine, independently of the state, whether the war was just. And if they said, you can't go to war, and they would enforce that with a penalty of excommunication. If you had, even rulers who would go to war could be disciplined by the church if the cause was not legitimate. So the church has ceded way too much authority to the state in making those kinds of decisions. That's a really long-term project to restore the church's authority like that, and to have that acknowledged. I mean, the thing that the Mennonite case is distinct because it has a tradition, but the Catholic Church has a tradition of just war, and so the Catholic Church has a built-in religious reason not to permit its members to engage in certain kinds of war. So Protestant churches generally don't do that. Protestants have generally just gone along with whatever the state has called them to do. I think we need to be much more skeptical as individuals. Very hard to fight it as an individual. You have to have this kind of communal confession and communal authority in order to really make it work effectively. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm not a pacifist out of principle. I don't think there's a biblical prohibition of engaging in war. I think war is a legitimate use of force, but it's not the first response, but it's a legitimate use of force in certain circumstances. I could see an argument for saying the political world, the world is so corrupted by lust for power and lust for money, pursuit of natural resources that you need to keep engines going and factories moving, that I can no longer judge what's actually happening. And so much propaganda. I can imagine a kind of tactical pacifism and say, I'm going to withdraw completely because I can't be confident that this is authorized by God. That's not a principled, foundational kind of pacifism, but I think I can see an argument for that. I should mention, let's see if I can think of the author's name. Anyway, I'll have to search around for it. There's a recent book on the just war tradition that I think is really helpful because he makes it clear that the just war tradition is intended to be very, very, very restrictive, and to keep it's different from pacifism because it does acknowledge that there is such a thing as a just war, but it's not. Contemporary uses of just war theory have generally been kind of checklist. Check that off, check that box, you can go to war. And the classical tradition that comes out of Augustine is in Aquinas. That's much more restrictive, and the distance between just war and pacifism practically is not as great. I can't remember the author of this book, but I found it very useful. Yeah, that's a good question. There were people in the early church who were pacifists, leaders of the early church who were pacifists. I don't think that was the universal teaching of the early church. I think there were also early Christians in the first couple of centuries who were not pacifists. And we know of various Christians who were in the Roman army. Some of them became martyrs in the Roman army because they refused to fight in certain battles. There are military martyrs that were killed by the Romans in the early centuries. So there were pacifist elements within the early church, but it wasn't universal. I mean, even just a specific evidence of that. This is into the 4th century, the early 4th century. But Diocletian Diocletian was the Roman emperor who carried out the last and the most vicious persecution against the church. He was the last emperor of United Rome prior to Constantine, who became a Christian. Diocletian, there's a famous scene where Diocletian was offering sacrifices. He had his soothsayers examining the entrails of the sacrifice. That's how you find out what's coming next. It's a way of divining the future. Something went wrong with that inspection of the entrails. And the soothsayer or somebody else told Diocletian, it's because there are Christians in the army. So this is Diocletian, a Roman emperor, who's sporadically persecuting Christians. And in his own army, there are Christians that are part of the military. So there were some, and the church never has had a firm position on the legitimacy of war. There have been elements that are pacifist. There are elements that are just war, variations of just war, and those have existed kind of side by side for most of the church history. Yeah. I think something like the same principle would apply, which means that there would be moments and cases where the civil law would permit and might even require something that a Christian judge would have to refuse to do. And I think that's a form of martyrdom. He wouldn't be killed, presumably, but he might lose his position as judge if he doesn't actually enforce the law that's on the books. I mean, that's happened in various places in the U.S. This is not about killing, but in various places in the U.S. after the gay marriage, the Supreme Court permitted gay marriage. There were a number of officials across the United States who refused to sign marriage certificates for gay marriages, even though by the law of the land they should be doing that. They refused to do that. So I think if you're a judge and you're a Christian judge presiding over a case, and the civil law requires capital punishment for a particular crime, and the crime has actually been committed, I think a Christian judge it's right for him to enforce that. But there will be times when he can't enforce the civil law, and a Christian just has to take the consequence of that. I mean, it's not just in civil realm that issue comes up. At least, again, in the States, and you may be this might be part of your future. I don't know how things are trending, but in the United States, within private organizations, businesses, universities, there's pressure to conform to certain norms and values. Sports, let's take a recent example. The National Hockey League, you know what ice hockey is? The National Hockey League, the Philadelphia Flyers is a National Hockey League a team. And they recently had a Pride night where every one of the players on the Philadelphia Flyers was supposed to wear some gay pride insignia. And there was one member of the Philadelphia Flyers team that refused. And a lot of an uproar. I mean, there are commentators that have said they should fine the Philadelphia Flyers $1 billion for allowing this guy to play without the pride insignia. So that kind of pressure comes. It's not just, and if you're looking ahead, I mean, for American pastors, most pastors are not going to have civil officials in their churches who are having that kind of situation, but they are going to have people who are in businesses that are going to be under all kinds of pressure to bow to the agenda of a radical sexual agenda. And pastors have to be warning people and preparing people to refuse and to risk even their livelihood to uphold Christian standards. So I don't know if that kind of scenario is looming for you all, but it's something to be alert to at least. Okay. The last thing I'll talk about in regard to the sixth word is Jesus and the sixth word. What does Jesus say about thou shalt not murder? This is one of the things that he deals with in the Sermon on the Mount. We looked at the last part of Matthew 5 earlier this week when we looked at his quotation of the lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and his instructions to his disciples to suffer the second, to use the slapping example, to endure the second slap. There's a doubling of the slap, but the disciple endures it, and in that way follows Jesus and diffuses a potentially violent situation and possibly opens up a possibility for reconciliation with the person who slapped. Okay, that's a way of participating in the righteous kingdom of God and practicing a righteousness that surpasses the scribes and Pharisees. And I think that's the same kind of logic that you have earlier in Matthew 5 when Jesus talks about murder. Let me read that and then make a few comments about it. This is Matthew 5:21 and following. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. If therefore you are presenting your offering to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering before the altar. Go your way, first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're on the way with him, in order that your opponent may not deliver you to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you shall not come out of there until you have paid the last cent, the last farthing. First of all, comment on how this portion of the Sermon on the Mount is put together. And this, what I'm going to say is, I think, true of a number of sections of the Sermon on the Mount. Typically, the Sermon on the Mount is understood to be organized by antitheses. Jesus says, you've heard it said, that's the one side, but I say to you. On the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand, you've heard it said, but I say to you. And if you read this section that way, you might be tempted to read it as saying, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder, but I say to you, don't be angry. And Jesus is giving a more internal, heart-oriented interpretation of that commandment. He's not, what's prohibited by the sixth word is not just killing and physical violence. What's prohibited is anger against someone, which could produce murder. So that's the way that this section is usually read, and the chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, is often understood as a series of antitheses. You heard it said, but I say to you. I think what's actually happening, this is not original with me, this comes from a commentator on somebody who's written a book on the Sermon on the Mount. What's actually happening in most of these cases is that it's a threefold structure rather than just a twofold structure. It's not just, you've heard thou shalt not murder, but I say to you, do not be angry. Rather, Jesus says, you've heard it said. In this case, he's quoting directly from the 10 words, and then he's summarizing something that's found throughout the Pentateuch. Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. That's found all the way through the Pentateuch. So he's summarizing something that's in the Old Testament. He's not summarizing oral tradition at that point. And then the second stage is not an imperative. Jesus never says, don't get angry. When he talks about anger, it's not an imperative. What he describes is the danger of being angry and how anger expressed in angry words, anger expressed in just your anger against your brother is guilt. And angry words can lead to escalation of situations. Jesus is describing the dynamics that can escalate inner attitudes into overt violent actions. The third part is the imperative part, which begins in verse 23. And here Jesus gives a couple of specific instructions to his disciples about how they're supposed to behave and act in different scenarios. So that's the structure. He's quoting from the Old Testament. You've heard it said, but I say to you, if you're angry, then you're liable to escalate it into murder, and you're already on the pathway to murder. But the imperative is not, don't be angry. The imperative is to reconcile with your brother and to make friends at court. Okay, so the imperatives have to do with actions, not with your emotion. Okay. And what does Jesus specifically tell them to do? If you're presenting an offering at the altar and you remember your brother has something against you, even though you're in the midst of worship, you leave worship and you go and reconcile with your brother, and then you bring your offering. That's the command. And notice how that addresses what's said in verse 22. Verse 22 describes an escalating series of courts: a court, a high court, Supreme Court, hell. And if you let your anger go free, you're liable to the court, and you're liable to be in a position, you're liable to let that escalate into actual violence. In order to arrest that process and keep your anger from growing into violence, you reconcile with your brother who has something against you. You make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're in the way with him. Or if you take Matthew 18's description, suppose you're in a situation where your brother has sinned against you. You're kind of seething. I can't believe he did that to me. Jesus' command is not suppress the anger, kill the anger. The result will be to kill the anger, but the command is to go to your brother, rebuke him, correct him. And if he listens to you, then you've recovered your brother. That's the righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. It's not a matter, again, the imperative is not about suppressing emotion. The imperative is things that you do which will have the effects of undoing the emotional state that will lead to murder and preventing murder, preventing violence, preventing assault on the image of God in your brother. Okay. This is the command in verses 23 to 25 is a specific way of applying what Jesus says at the end of the chapter, which is to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, overcome evil with good, as Paul says. So the action is to seek reconciliation. The action is to make friends quickly. The second scenario, the first scenario is so you remember that your brother has something against you. The second scenario is you're being taken to court. So you're at legal odds. That can escalate into something that would, it could escalate into you going to jail. So you try to settle out of court. And that's a positive, instead of simply avoiding murder, you're reversing and undoing situations that might lead to murder or force redemptively. That's participation in the righteousness of Christ, and that's the righteousness, the redemptive righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of scribes and Pharisees. Okay. So the same dynamic or the same principle is at work as we talked about earlier in the week. Do you all get what I'm saying about the structure of verses 21 through 26? It's triadic structure, and the command has to do with your actions in these particular scenarios. And then, of course, we can think about if you're in other kinds of scenarios where there's strife, anger, hatred, estrangement that could lead to violence, what kind of creative actions can you take to arrest that process and to reverse it so that instead of escalating to violence, it leads to reconciliation and peace? Yeah. And that's how Jesus commands us to keep the sixth word. The sixth word is kept not only by avoiding violence, avoiding overt murder, but also avoiding assaults of any kind. It's not just a negative command. It is that, but it's not just a negative command to avoid violence and murder. As Jesus describes it, it's a set of positive actions, a set of creative positive actions that lead to that are in pursuit of reconciliation and justice. One thing to keep in mind, Jesus does not tell us to have nothing to do with our enemies. Jesus doesn't tell us just to leave them alone. If you have a brother who has something against you, Jesus doesn't let you just let that simmer. I'll overlook it. I can handle it. I'll overlook it. I'm a magnanimous man. No, Jesus says you have to confront it. And he doesn't say that you just leave your enemies alone. You love your enemies and do good for them. There's positive action that's done, redemptive action, finding creative ways to reverse situations of enmity so they don't escalate. That's the positive way of keeping the sixth word. Romans 12 I've alluded to a number of times. Let me read the portion that I've alluded to. Verse 17 of Romans 12. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Never. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, as far as depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own vengeance, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. Okay? And if your enemy is hungry, you don't just avoid him and kind of secretly rejoice that he's hungry. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. What is that? That sounds painful. By doing good to your enemy, you're heaping coals. Does that mean that you're somehow bringing him the punishments of hell? Or, possibly, you're heaping burning coals on his head so that he becomes something like an altar. You do good to your enemy, and that turns him into a living sacrifice, which is what Paul talks about at the beginning of chapter 12. Maybe it's that. And then verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's the way to keep the sixth word. It's not just by avoiding assaults and murders, but by finding creative, Christ-like ways to intervene in the lives of enemies and estranged friends in order to bring reconciliation.